Welcome back to another episode here of Survival Worldwide on Reality Pop. Riley and myself is joined by our very first guest from Australian Survivor, Brawns versus Brawns. It's Wai. Wai, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks so much for having me, guys. It was really great to watch you guys kind of recap through the season, and here we are, post-season analysis.
We tried our best. We tried our best. That sometimes we appreciate myself and Riley as two pretty big fans. Sometimes we throw the term super fans out there pretty loosely. I think Riley can count more as a super fan than myself because I sometimes get my facts wrong and he keeps me straight. But you know, we appreciate that sometimes we don't get to see everything while people are out there on the island. So obviously, having this opportunity to talk to you here today to talk a little bit about your game is something that both of us have looked forward to a lot. But before we get into the game, I guess the nitty gritty, I noticed that you've got a really nice bookshelf there at the back with a bunch of books. And I thought, since you're an author, my first question to you is, what are you reading currently? What's your latest book? And are you into fiction or non-fiction?
Ooh, excellent questions. I love talking about books, probably. Yes. So right now I am actually reading. Oh, there's a plug for you. Henry Hamlet's Heart. It is a Love Oz YA book written by Rhiannon Wild. She's a debut author. I'm really enjoying it so far. I read a lot of young adult books, so I typically read fiction because I'm a young adult author. So you kind of have to read the things that you write about and stuff. So I write books for teens and kids and love a good young adult, especially in Australia. We have a really good, I guess, group of Australian authors, most of them are whom are friends, but I think we write really good kind of young adult books. So yeah, so I'm a keen reader, as you can probably tell, definitely in that brain space.
Yeah. No, I'm someone that loves books as well. I'm actually reading The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck at the moment, which I'm really enjoying. It's quite an interesting book, a little bit about human psychology as well. And I kind of like those kind of books in general. Anything that's in regards to self-betterment and self-help and that type of stuff is what I'm really into in business books. A little bit nerdy as well, but because I work in business, it definitely does help. Now, Wai, I was sort of wondering, being out there on Australian Survivor, did it give you any new sort of content and ideas while you were out there? Because obviously you would have had a lot of time with yourself there, where potentially you would have been able to think about things, where you are in life and what you're going to do next and potentially what your next book is going to be about. Did you get any inspiration being out there? And will we see characters that would resemble King George and Queen Hayley in some of the future books there?
That is an awesome question. Yes, being out in Survivor was a really interesting experience for me as an author. It was the first time I was kind of doing something and I couldn't write stuff down, which for me was actually one of the bigger frustrations, I think, about the whole experience. Because I'm like, oh, I really want to capture this. And it's like trying writing stick in the ground. Now that doesn't work. But yeah, I got a lot of, it was a really good experience for me, and that was part of the reason why I went on the show in general, was because I do feel like as a writer you kind of learn a lot from those lived experiences. And I met so many people I don't think I would have normally encountered in my day-to-day, George and Hayley being probably some of them. So I think having those types of interactions and also understanding a lot of what being human boiled down to, that really basic experience. Most of the time my life is, first world problems, and I'm worried about all these big things that come out. But really when you come down to you're hungry, you're tired, you're just trying to survive, people are trying to backstab you, and trying to think through those kind of basic experiences is, yeah, really enlightening. And I really enjoyed it. But was really rewarding for me as an author. So I do have some ideas kicking around. I will say that COVID's been hard and I haven't really been writing so much, which was also why I was like, hey, Survivor is a good thing to do. I'm not kind of at the keyboard all the time. So yeah, lots of ideas, hoping to get some good stuff on paper to, hopefully become a story. But books take a long time to write. They don't write themselves. So see how it goes. Keep an eye out for, King George, the illustrated version or something. He'd love it. Oh my God, he would love that so much.
We'd certainly love to see it. Now, Wai, were you a big fan of Australian Survivor going into the show? What was your sort of experience with the show before you went on? Were you a fan from day one or from when Australian Survivor started in 2016? What was the level of fandom?
Yeah, so I'm more of a casual fan. I definitely consider I'm familiar with the game. I've watched. I my introduction to Survivor was those early seasons in this U.S. because I'm obviously American, so that was when Survivor first came out. It was one of the first reality TV shows essentially to be made, and I love that the format has kind of stayed consistent. Like there's more things involved now, obviously, but so yeah. So from then, I watched a couple of seasons of Australian Survivor, but not even on that like kind of really in depth kind of super fan way that you guys do. Probably usually like second screened it, but love a lot of the characters. Think the production was pretty awesome, but I do love the like how the game has pretty much always been the same since those early 2000 times because it's just such a good format, and I think that's why it's still so successful as a franchise compared to all the other renditions of reality TV we have now. So definitely know the mechanics. Definitely wasn't expecting as many twists like that. That was definitely I think to this season compared to anything I've seen before. But certainly, yeah, I think the format has been what it is, and the players have obviously gotten very, very good. It's the same across, I think, so many of our reality TV competitions. But yeah, I think the level of survivor player you have now with people like George and Hayley and all that strategic thinking is very different to how I think the earlier renditions and earlier seasons were because people have just watched so many more players play it.
Can you talk us through sort of what made you want to play the game? Were you approached by production that they headhunt you, or did you see the advertisement out there for people to apply for the show? How did that process work?
Yeah, I won't get too much into the details of it. I will say that it was something that I didn't think of myself. So it's definitely something that I didn't go through this standard application process, but you do have to still go through the same process that everyone does. So even if I think this year as well, the process was a little bit different because of COVID. Basically, I believe that they had a cast from last year, but their selected group that they had last year, but not everyone could carry over into this year when after they canceled last year's production, they had to, bring everything forward to this year. So in that time and vein, because of the theme, they wanted to plug in some gaps. So I was one of those gap plugins, I think is how I would explain it. So yeah, but went through the application process in a really kind of quick time kind of turnaround point of view, and then and ended up in the show, which I was still very surprised that I could get through that.
Obviously, the Australian Survivor, Brains vs. Brawn, being based in Cloncurry, Queensland. I know a big part of your arc, there was a little bit about you having aquaphobia and not being able to swim too well. How is that adjusting to obviously being in the outback and not being on an island in Fiji?
Yeah, that was quite an interesting one. So, being I can do a doggy paddle and I could swim. So, and I think one of those questions that go, how can someone get on Survivor without swimming? And you do have to take a test. You have to swim a certain amount, any stroke you want. I could swim the backstroke. I think there are certain parts of the parts that didn't air where you do see me try desperately to swim something in backstroke, and I didn't drown, but it wasn't pretty. But I think a part of me when I went on was thinking, we are in the outback. Are they going to find a body of water? And I kind of played the odds a little bit going, it can't be as much water as you normally would think it would be in Fiji. So that did play on my mind a little bit. And then I did some research and went, oh, there's a dam. I bet they're going to make us swim in the dam. And that's exactly what happened. Was that the Cloncurry Dam became where all the water challenges were. But I think compared to many of the other previous seasons, yes, there was a lot less water, but certainly water was there. I knew going in that I would have to kind of deal with this. I was very upfront about the fact that, I'm not I do have I don't think it's diagnosed as aquaphobia. I haven't spoken to anyone, but I am very nervous every time I get into water and stuff like that. I kind of have to tamp it down. I went scuba diving in Fiji and basically had a panic attack right before I could go in and stuff. And they really give them time to take me through and stuff like that. So definitely something that's irrational, as many fears are. And I knew to have to deal with this somehow on national TV. And I was like, it'll be fine. I'll figure it out. And what you probably saw was me actually trying to mentally figure that out through that time. And, if you're going to do it, what a way to do it, right? National TV, swimming with a world champion surfer, that's one way to try and, deal with the fear.
100%. So I'm sort of curious in those early stages of getting into the game and obviously being selected to be in the Brains tribe. I guess two questions here. Firstly, what was it like finding out you were in the Brains tribe? Were you shocked by that and by the people around you that were also in the Brains tribe? And then secondly, how did you feel you fitted in those early stages as someone that had an accent coming into this as well? Because obviously people would have probably picked up that you originally were from America. Did you feel like in those early stages it made it a little bit harder for you because it's such a social sort of political game as well? So I guess two questions there around the Brains theme and also just about having an accent and being from America coming into the show.
Oh, those are really interesting questions. So the first question about being a brain, no, I was not surprised that I was a brain, and I would have been there. There would have been some giant mistake if that hadn't happened. Definitely felt, and especially once I found out the theme, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Why? What gap I was trying to fill, etc. So I think yes, definitely felt at home on the Brains tribe. I think going into the Brains tribe, I was actually quite surprised and quite impressed with, I guess, how the makeup of the Brains tribe went on. And it wasn't like, I was thinking it was going to be a bunch of software engineers and like, mathematicians, but it was actually how they defined brains was really, really clever. And I think really made the show kind of that tribe, especially very unique and balanced. You had someone like Andrew, who's like a wildlife expert, a complete nerd, but also completely a physical beast in that way, because he's a brain in a very particular way, as an example. So I thought that was really, really clever. And I think I was probably the most like the nerdiest of the brains in that way. I think I filled that archetype quite well of just being someone who was very not outdoors and very completely uncomfortable in so many elements, in so many ways in that. So yeah, but I thought that the way they had that tribe come together was really, really clever. And I did feel mostly at home with the tribe, not so much in the environment and what was going on, but went through that. To answer your second question, no, that actually didn't come up with the accent. So yes, people could pick that I was American. I think also being a woman of color and being like, obviously quite not non-Caucasian, I think was already something that, I think specifically with Australian Survivor, I think, it's a very different makeup. And I think being someone who is of a different racial background is something that, people will notice and people are mindful of. So the fact that I have an American accent, I think doesn't really kind of take away or add to, I guess, that understanding of what that represents and everything. So yeah, so I don't think, and I've always been very upfront about being American, but I've also lived in Australia for so long that I think I'm pretty acclimatized to, like, I guess, the, Australianisms and the colloquialisms, but there are very small things that are still surprising. I actually had my very first finger bun while I was out there. They didn't show this as one of the days we had finger buns as a reward or just something. And I was like, I've never had one of these before. And that was like, one of those talking points we could go through in terms of cultural understanding, because I honestly had never had one. I couldn't
explain it to because we do have 70% of the people who listen to our podcast is actually from America, not from Australia, funny enough. So explain it to the Americans that are listening to this interview. What is a finger bun?
A finger bun is basically kind of like a hot dog bun. I'm going to call it a hot dog bun because that was basically my brain going like, oh my God, this is like white bread in a long form. And you put like pink icing on top of it. And it's like the sweet bread treat essentially. But I've never had anything. I've lived in Australia since 2006. Never had this before. I think mostly because I live in Sydney and it's not really like a cosmopolitan Sydney thing or something. But yeah, but it was absolutely delicious. Especially, I think we had it on day 40. I think it was one of those, congratulations, you've made it to day 40, but they didn't air this part, I realized, in the show, but you made it to day 40. Here, we're actually going to feed you without you needing to earn it. So that was very nice. And it was a very lovely, sweet treat to have in that way. And an introduction to another avenue of Australian culture, which is fantastic.
They do say Survivor's all about new experiences, don't they? But early on in the game, how did you sort of adjust straight away, really? Because you lost that first immunity challenge and the first reward challenge as well. You were obviously thrown into the calling position in that first reward challenge. So immediately after you guys lost that challenge, a little bit of a target thrown in your back. Not a great position to be in early on, but who did you sort of gravitate towards early on those first 2 days? Because we did see that you were sort of the target at the first tribal council there.
Yeah, it was. And it's funny because I feel like those first 2 days really hit me quite hard. And I think I wasn't like mentally ready. Like you think you're ready when you go in, you're like, okay, this is going to be tough and it's difficult. But I think that for me, it was quite an overwhelming first 2 days, and I was quite overwhelmed and caught off guard. Definitely, the challenges were really tough, and I think approached those first 2 days trying to be as, I guess, open to relationships as possible. But I'm actually quite, and you kind of can tell this from the show, especially like because I don't talk much, is I'm actually quite introverted. So the concept of I'm a performative introvert, in that in a situation like this I can talk to you guys and be really like on, but then like I need a time to be alone and like kind of recharge. In a situation where you're living 24 hours with strangers and having like cameras watching you was quite confronting, I think. So I was just trying to basically form the relationships that I could form. And transparently, George was one of the first people that I had formed a great relationship with. And we actually come from the same local council. We all know he's from Bankstown. I'm actually from the same council, but not that area, a few suburbs over in a place called Campsie. But yeah, it is quite funny. So we had a little bit of that bond, I think, early on. And he's such a charismatic guy. He, talks to everyone and is really just someone who is very just loves to talk. And for someone who's a little bit quieter, I really think I appreciated that element of him versus I think someone like Mitch, for example, which you can see like there was a little bit more animosity there because he was actually also quite more reserved and quiet. So in the beginning, it was harder to sort of go to someone like Mitch and like have those types of conversations because he's doing his own thing. Also Phil, who of course we didn't get to see much from, they were really like open and social and, and I think would have played an amazing social game as well. So I think early on, those were the types of relationships that I was forming, but it all happened so fast and everything, you're trying to do so many things at that time. But I think in those first 2 days, those were the types of relationships that were standing out to me in hindsight now.
Now, you sort of bring up George a few times there. Now, obviously, we can't talk to you without bringing George up. I think we can't talk about the season without bringing George up at some point in any case. But, he saves you here in the first vote, which comes as a bit of a surprise. You guys have a conversation the next day where you ask him why he saved you. And he said that he saw something in you that he thought he wanted to protect or have in the game with him there as well. But your relationship with George was quite a complicated one throughout the season. And there were certain times where you were getting a bit of abuse even on social media for turning your back on George at certain times early in the game. Can you talk us through sort of a little bit about that relationship between yourself and George and where things sort of went wrong there in regards to you guys being able to work together? Even though he saved you, it looked like there were potentially a lack of communication at certain times, or maybe your ways of communicating, you kind of hinted it there, is very different. Can you talk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, definitely. No, first of all, and I think, it's always funny because we watch through the game and you kind of everything you see on screen, you think is the full picture. Of course, we all know it's not. And also, I think the players and the people who are in the game are very different to the people who are in real life and everything. George and I have an amazing relationship. Like I said, he lives not too far away from me. He's actually probably going to end up being my LGA buddy in this regard. Because of the way lockdown is working right now in Sydney and stuff like that, the fact that he lives in my LGA, I'll probably see him much sooner than anyone else. So love him, absolutely have a great relationship with him, still talk to him very often, probably like every other day or something, depending on days, just dropping notes and sending memes, those kind of relationships. So yeah, but it is funny because in the game, you recognize the types of players and what you're trying to accomplish in a game. And I think early on, yes, I was very surprised that George had saved me. I knew going into that first tribal that my head was on the chopping block. I didn't have a solution to save me. I was kind of going, I don't know what we're going to do. I knew like I was going to vote for Mitch because that was George had told me he was going to vote for Mitch, and he had alluded that there might be a couple more people. I'm like, well, this is my only option. I don't have enough stronger relationships. I don't have anything of value at this stage to trade. So I think that was the thing. I had nothing of value to trade, and I was just like, well, I'm probably going to go home because I don't know what else to do right now. I couldn't, I just couldn't figure out anything at that stage. So George did save me. I was exceptionally grateful. And in those early weeks that followed, and we do have to remember it's almost weeks. I think it's like up to day 8. I can't count the number of days anymore, but we miss about 3 tribals after that first tribal before we have to go back. So while during those days when we're not at tribal, it's a lot of strategy and a lot of discussion and a lot of gameplay is still happening. And George and I were basically working together all the time, and yeah, like discussing lots of things. And George, of course, is always thinking about the game, has a very particular way of playing. And I recognized that from the beginning that, wow, this guy has a lot of strategy. I think where for me as a player, I really admire his game, and watching it back, I'm so impressed by what he did every single moment. All of those moments, he had so much control. Less so, especially after merge, I think, obviously, and even after swap, I think the dynamics changed. In that early Brains tribe, I think he saved everyone in that first tribal, and then it was hard to kind of, for various reasons, he did it in a way that didn't kind of win him lots of friends. And he found it hard to be in that alliance. So it found it hard to kind of reestablish those relationships. So for me, playing with him was really good in that I had someone who was leading strategy all the time. But for me, as a kind of, I guess, shyer player and someone who kind of operates, I knew the type of player that I was going to be someone who processed a lot of information and then made strategic decisions. But I needed the social connections to be able to gain the information. Playing with George early on in those days, it made it very hard for me to form those social relationships because everyone was mindful of how that information would be fed back to George. And we were both playing from the bottom. And I think, I'm happy to play from bottom, but I'm not actually a very good player from the bottom. So I'm very lucky and grateful that he saved me. And I had to play from the bottom. And it's just not somewhere that I could feel my game doing really well with. So I did make a decision to kind of move from a bottom to like a lower middle, because then at least I'd have the gain of information. Specifically, it was actually the Mitch blind side where I had no idea that was happening, that I realized my own game was in jeopardy because I was missing information because nobody was giving it to me. And that was specifically where I was like, I kind of think I have to make a move, make a change, and trade a number, essentially. So of course, we're all talking about the Joey blind side, not the Joey blind side, the moment where I switched into Joey's alliance before his blind side. And it was that moment where I'm like, I just need to reposition myself to gain information so that I can play the type of game that I can play. And and I made that type of decision, and it did change my relationship with George. And then later on, we go through many days and we played separately because of swap and everything. And now we have new relationships and everything. And I'll let you guys kind of talk me through that. But in those early days, that was kind of that discussion and the thinking behind how that particular move and how George particularly played in those early days that affected my decision to make the types of moves that I did.
Yeah, I suppose with the swap, obviously you were a pivotal part in the challenges on the early Brains tribe. You mentioned that you won 3 straight immunity challenges, and you were the queen of the puzzles, alongside George, obviously performing well in those puzzles as well. So you were a big part of that. And going into the Shannon and Laura vote, you won a challenge there. You won and got immunity alongside Andrew. How did you sort of adjust to the new Brawn tribe early on and build those relationships, especially given that you 4 were in a minority there?
Yeah, that was a really fantastic and also terrifying situation to be in. First and foremost was I was exceptionally grateful when swap happened, that when we unwrapped our buffs, that I saw that I was in the same tribe as Hayley. Hayley and I had already started to form quite a strong relationship early on in those days. Haley, Rachel, and I were of course working together to blindside Joey, and I think the 3 of us had wanted to intend to kind of stick together for as long as we could. And unfortunately, Rachel ended up on the other tribe, and we didn't really get to work with her again. But Haley and I got to work together, and that was really, really fantastic. So I think together, Haley and I actually, I felt particularly grateful to be moving into the Brawn tribe with her as a very strong sort of partner, and then having, of course, Andrew and Baden there as well. And I think it was really good for us to move into the Brawn tribe. I've certainly felt comfortable. I think the additional strength that the new Brawn tribe and the mixing of how we had Brawn and Brain was actually beneficial for us, because I think my lack of strength was too apparent in the Brains tribe, where everyone had to basically literally carry their own weight, and I was not very good at that. I could play a puzzle, but I couldn't physically carry anything. Versus I think when we got to swap, having that wasn't seen as so much of an issue, because the other tribe mates who were stronger physically were able to literally help carry some of my weight, as demonstrated by Flick. in that water challenge. So I think I was really grateful. I was, of course, very upfront with they'd already seen me perform in challenges, but also knew that my brain and my puzzling abilities would help at least secure me that spot. So yeah, so I did feel much more secure when we moved into that bronze trot. And then beanbags are the great equalizer. And somehow, because we all agreed to work together and get to the end, and we got to the beanbag challenge, and it was fantastic. So unknown thing that Simon has mentioned previously. So since he said it, I will say it as well. And I'm very grateful. And he accidentally landed my first beanbag in that beanbag immunity challenge. If that was part of the rules, that and we were all landing beanbags on each other's, well, not me specifically, but part of the rules was if you landed on someone else's podium and it sticks, it's theirs. That's universal. So yeah, so I just managed to not knock it off and land the second one by myself. So that was also really helpful. So beanbags are the great equalizer. We love a good beanbag toss.
So wait, you guys took out quite a few big names before the merge. You mentioned Joey there, who looked like he was pretty much the ringleader of that alliance that was forming there in the Brains. And then you also took out Shannon and Simon, who all had very big edits. Who would you say was probably the biggest threat going into the merge, the person you were sort of the happiest to get, before they got to merge, because you thought if they made the merge, they could make a run very deep into the game? Would it be one of those three, or was there someone else that potentially the edit didn't really show us that?
Well, I think ultimately getting into merge, I think it was good that we took out Simon with his two idols for various reasons. Specifically for having two idols so close to merge. So yeah, definitely a good thing to have that, not have to deal with that at merge. I think all three of those players were exceptionally great. I think Joey we did take out quite early before swap. We did actually kind of consider that swap was happening, and part of our thinking was, that the downfall of any of that might actually protect us. We might be protected because we felt like something was happening. So I think that was a good time to take out Joey and do something unexpected without kind of putting targets on our backs. I say ours. It was completely led by Hayley in that vein. And then Rachel and I were definitely very excited to have someone who was so keen to do that and kind of, be able to form that block to do that. So kudos to Hayley for making such a big move earlier. But yeah, I think definitely those were three. And Shannon was an amazing player and was definitely a strategic threat. Interesting with Shannon, because I didn't really get to play with her a lot. And I would have personally probably liked to have played with her longer. And I think I could have had a pretty strong relationship with her further down the game. What ultimately I do know, there was a large part of my decision to send her home over Laura, and a lot of that just had to do with keeping that brain. We needed to keep the brain number up, because if we had kept Shannon, we might be able to bring her on, etc. But it just causes too many. Versus I knew of the solid four, this would keep the brains at least on equal footing with the other four Brawn, and that would just help our numbers more, because we couldn't guarantee that brains were going to win more immunity alliances. So it was just such a tricky time at that moment. And I do kind of feel bad that we had to send her home then, but it was just, it became a numbers thing more. And so many of the time it does become a numbers thing.
With that Shannon vote, initially when you had that power alongside Andrew, Rachel, and I think it was someone else. Anyway, the Emmett, of course. Emmett was winning all the challenges. But you had that power, obviously, to vote out either Laura or Shannon. First of all, you voted for Laura. And then obviously after Emmett also voted for Laura, Simon sort of quipped up and said that Shannon was actually causing a lot of animosity amongst the tribe. Was that decision to get rid of Laura initially, was that sort of to create a little bit more calm around the camp, or was it to potentially keep your position on the Brawns tribe a little bit more safe by sticking with a member of your tribe in Shannon?
Yeah, so that was an interesting kind of tribal, and it was a little bit. It was interesting because we held all the power, but we were not part of, and so early in the swap when we don't have all the dynamics established, we were so lucky. Andrew and I were so lucky that we had Hayley basically kind of forming plans for us, because we were, of course, away on our reward, enjoying our reward and having our little chats and having no idea what's going on there. Hayley debriefed us, told us about her split, her amazing move. And I, again, was just so impressed by her ability to pull that off. But of course she can. She's Queen Hayley. I knew that from the beginning. But with that being said, I that was the only firsthand information I had wasn't really solid. And yes, my gut, when they gave us that power, it was actually quite debilitating because I didn't know what the right decision was, and there wasn't really a chance to kind of chat that through with the rest of the alliance, because it was like, what do I do? I don't know enough. And again, I'm the type of player who plays with information. I don't know enough to really know what's the best decision. And I was thinking of the alliance specifically. So my gut was, well, don't upset the tribe, kick out the other person, keep us at least, harmonious in some way, because we have to wake up tomorrow and work together. And it was Simon piping up, kind of going, oh, actually, no. And then me quickly reevaluating the numbers, going, this is the safest way, again, to keep the brains strong, which is the 4 of us, is to actually boot out the other person. And then we're back to 4-4. And if there's already, because Hayley had mentioned that the Brawns split open, but I hadn't witnessed how split it was. And there was always that part of me, are they just going to vote one of us out? We don't know, but at least we have that idol, and stuff like that. Because you never know. You think that they're kind of double bluffing us. But to see that play out in Tribal, I'm like, actually, this is a weakness that we can exploit. And then it made me switch my vote straight away to Shannon, kind of going, this will keep the numbers strong. And there's enough of a break there that I don't think that this will suddenly put us more in jeopardy because we've done something to upset people, etc. It's so tricky because you think you know everything, but you can never know everything. And you make these decisions kind of going, why these twists? This is not how the game is supposed to work. Why are you doing this to us now?
How much of a disadvantage was it to your alliance losing Rachel here before the merge? Because you mentioned her quite a few times as someone that worked very closely with yourself and Hayley. And how did you sort of pivot after finding out that she would not be that person that you can rely on come the merge time?
Yeah, look, losing Rachel was a bit of was quite gutting. Hayley and I did talk about trying to figure out ways to, I think we had sneaky little quick chats when we could with, I think Hayley whispered something to Kez to try and like kind of balance it out, etc. But we also knew, we could sense what was happening just from watching, the other tribe on the other side, and knew that those numbers were coming down and the brains were being picked off. And the only thing we could do was to keep our numbers strong and to keep our 4. And we didn't lose a single brain that entire swap, which was basically the best we could do. I mean, I think we also tried to form stronger relationships with the Brawn. I think Flick being our main sort of target or hope to being able to convert her over. And we knew she had strong alliances on the other end, so that would help our numbers. So we were hoping that those numbers would pan out. But ultimately, we kind of were like, yeah, it was unfortunate, but we knew it wasn't any. It's funny because as the days go further on and as you play the game, I realized that you just don't have control over things you don't have control of, and you just have to play with what you can control. And what we could control the best to our ability was what was happening on our tribe, and whatever fallout happened there, it just happens. And you just deal with the situation when it comes and be like, these are the new parameters and variables to work with. How do we make this work? So yeah, so it was just very unfortunate, but there wasn't anything that could be done. And that was how that tribe unfolded there.
So I guess, how surprised were you that George found a way to survive within that tribe and sort of ride the old Brawns alliance and then make his way to the merge? And then at that point, how reluctant were you guys after finding out that he made it to the merge to actually work with him on the Kez vote when he came to you guys about the fact that she had an idol? Can you talk us through a little bit of some of the decision making and specifically your thoughts in regards to it? Because I feel like at certain times, especially at the merge, your edit became what we call in the survival world a bit of a purple edit. We didn't see much of you for a while. So if you can talk us through that, that'd be really good.
Yeah. Oh, look, I'm not surprised that George managed to do so well in the other tribe. A lot of that has to do with Kara. I will say that, Kara is an amazing social player. She earned a lot of trust amongst, the tribe members, especially in the Brawn tribe, and everyone really trusted her. And I think being able to lean on that and utilize that duo is, of course, a great balance of each other. George is an exceptionally strategic player, and Kara is an exceptionally social player. And I think those two combined were just a really great force. So we weren't, and especially with Kara's situation of where she ended up swapping, she became the first brain to be the brawn. You know, we knew that she already had those relationships. So yeah, so it wasn't surprising to us what was happening over there. It was gutting, like I said, because we knew we were losing potential alliance members, but for merge, but also recognizing that, you know, it wasn't anything we could do about. So definitely not surprised that George made it as far as he did. When it came to merge, we were hoping that the numbers would be in much our favor. We were very hoping that, you know, we kind of knew either original brains, we had the numbers, but of course, George and Kara wanted to stick with the brawn. And of course, we were hopeful for Flick, but that also didn't pan out. So we were pretty terrified, I think, when we came to merge and realized that the only number we gained was Laura, and we were so solidly on the bottom of an 8-5, and that's not a comfortable area to be in. So George was essentially being a double agent was our only option. It was either trust George and go with him with the Kes vote and the subsequent votes that he suggested, or basically lose one of us, and we just could not afford to lose anyone at that stage. So I think we did ultimately all kind of realize that we had to stick as strong as possible, which is where, you know, some of the things that Hayley did, and, you know, part of my purple edit is, of course, lots of things were happening and I was just there trying not to call attention to myself, especially in that situation. Once again, I'm at the bottom. I don't play personally. My game doesn't evolve very well from the bottom, and it is just stay as quiet as I can and hope to God I'm not a target because I'm not a physical threat, because now that we're in merge, I'm, you know, not likely to win an immunity challenge versus Emmett. So yeah, so it is an accurate edit, I think, of how that part of the game transpired. Obviously, I was doing a lot more than just, you know, not being there. I was physically there. But yeah, but so many things were happening, obviously, with people trying to reposition themselves in so many ways, and how those fallouts happened and how those strategies panned out. And I think there's just lots to be said there about, you know, there are so many people, and especially when you get to merge, you're looking at 13 individual games again. Those, you're not looking at pairs and groups and alliances anymore. You're once again re-examining 13 individual games, and too much is happening, I think, for them to show on that. And it's funny because while it was purple editing, I also knew what my final trajectory was. So you kind of go, yeah, but I know when it's going to change, and I know when it kind of matters and things like that. But you forget that even, and like, am I even still on this show? So yeah. But I did kind of know what was happening towards the pointier end of the game.
Yeah, you mentioned you were sort of fading away a little bit, not to attract the target on yourself. With that Hayley blind, or not so much a blindside, obviously a unanimous vote, and you were a part of that, the 9-1 vote there. You mentioned Hayley, you were pretty close with her, especially on that Brawns tribe, and later after that, Mitch and Joey blindside on the original Brains. How hard did you, Andrew and Laura, sort of work to try and keep her in the game, or were you sort of trying to shift the target away as much as possible and just say we can lose a member now and try and rework our alliances going forward?
It was pretty tricky because of the situation that we were in, of being completely reliant on George being the double agent, and Hayley's decision essentially took away, I guess, the only power or position we thought we still had. Essentially, it was a tricky one. I don't blame her for doing that. I think strategically it makes sense as a move to try and save yourself. What I think and Hayley and I have discussed this, I think, a little bit after she came back and everything, where I think that kind of move went wrong is I don't think personally that she had anything of value to trade. She had information, but information is only useful if someone can do something with it. And I don't think at that stage the information was particularly of value for her to utilize. Like, I get it. It was a bit, you know, it needed to be done. It seemed a bit desperate, but what else was she going to do? I think she felt that she was a big target. If someone from the Brains Alliance was going to go first, it was going to be her anyway. So she was going to throw a bit of a way to try and get that target off her back. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful. Versus, I think I was in a better position because I wasn't a threat and because I hadn't made any moves that I couldn't think things like that going, well, what are we going to do? It was unfortunately, we did all kind of vote for Hayley at that stage because, well, personally for me, I was working quite closely with her, but also knew there was no point in me saving her. That would just put a target on my back at that stage because there was no way we were going to get the numbers. And I knew that, yeah, and where Andrew and Laura sat on that, and it was just like hide in the majority or make a stand and say, hey, no, I didn't vote for her, and then people will go, why, you're next. And you just have to make those types of decisions. So I don't think Hayley holds that against me. We've talked about it. She completely understands that there's no point in trying to vote with something called loyalty. What's loyalty? This is Survivor. I don't know. But there was no, it just becomes a numbers game. And if you hide in the numbers and your numbers don't matter, you might as well stick with the majority because that's the safest place to be. So yeah, so it was look, I think to answer your question, I don't think we fought particularly hard because there was no backup. Because if we fought to save her, then what else, at least this way, the rest of us live another day. And then, of course, she came back and gave her number back to us, which was great. Like we were, and it was a bit of a shame because it was Baden and Hayley who would have helped benefited us either way. So it was a bit of a, we were going to gain a number back anyway. So yeah, it is what it is.
So I've got a question on the whole Baden thing. Baden was taken out here specifically in a way where it sort of came across on the TV show like he was a number for potentially George, and that's the reason that he was targeted here within your Minority Alliance. In your opinion, from what you know, was he really closer to George and Kara than what he was to you guys? Do you feel that was an accurate assessment by the Brawns at that stage in the game? And secondly, after that, I want to ask you also a question around the twist, because I came onto this show very passionately about saying it's the worst twist that we've ever seen in any season of Survivor. I put it even as worse than Edge of Extinction, which I don't know if you know what that is, but it's basically someone gets voted out. They get to go spend time with the jury on an island, so they can game with the jury, become friends with the jury, and come back at the final 5 and then win the game, which I absolutely hate. But this for me is even worse than the Edge. I would rather have the Edge back than the position where one person gets to vote somebody out solely. I had very strong feelings about that. So I guess firstly the Baden question, and then secondly, did it piss you guys off as much as it did me when you saw this happening, this twist? I don't know if you can be honest about it or not, or was there another twist that annoyed you even more than this one, or was the feeling mutual around it? Because I was livid coming onto the podcast when I saw that.
Sure, definitely. Well, first of all, with the Baden thing, I was actually more Baden, it was known, I think, throughout the Merge tribe that yes, Baden had a closer relationship with George and Kara. It was, so I can't comment too much about it because it was kind of news to me, exactly like that conversation that Danny and Emmett had. That was the first time I'd seen that conversation and was like, oh, that was their reasoning behind it. I knew it was, we all knew obviously they were going to target a brain of, and we felt it would likely be Hayley. At that stage, I think we thought it would be Hayley or Baden. So I'm not too surprised that it ended up being Baden and it wasn't specifically Hayley. I'm pretty sure, and this is part of where, Hayley had to make her big move there, was that she was pretty paranoid it was going to be her. And I think it just came down to, I guess, strength and threat. And I think Baden and Hayley seemed more likely to be physical threats in challenges. So that was my understanding of it. I didn't really see the George and Kara positioning of him being the leak for the double agent being until I basically watched that episode. So I'm actually surprised by that. I wasn't surprised that everybody sort of knew that George was the mole, but didn't say anything or was protecting him. Like that I kind of saw was I understood that dynamic for what it was, which was, but he's useful. And these things are, he's useful for both sides. So yeah, so I think that Baden, being taken out that point, that was gutting. That twist, I do feel like there were a ridiculous number of twists this season that we hadn't seen before, starting all the way from that first advantage that was shown at first tribal. I get it from a cinematographic. It was so controversial. It, started the season off with a bang. Me, the storyteller, totally gets it, but never seen something like that before. And the way it was executed, it really changed how all of us, I think, approach the game. I mean, like I said, I'm a casual viewer, so, but I'm aware of, Edge of Extinction. I've seen that and I've heard of it and kind of go, oh, that's one of those things that they do. Okay. But this one kind of set us off on the foot of, wow, this season's going to be bizarre. And there were a few other ones like this, like the car turning back, being turned around one. And just, we were kind of ready for these ridiculous twists. So I think while you were very shocked and annoyed that this was probably the worst twist that you'd ever seen, I hate it because it does give all the power to one particular person in that way. And, you know, sure, they earned it because of fire, and fire is so important, but it does kind of it gives the power to one person for no reason, rhyme or reason, because it was already narrowed down to only 3. And any strategy that you try to create in that time becomes absolutely moot. So it becomes, what is the point of this game? Let's just have one person make all the decisions. Like, why trick us into thinking you're going to have a 3 and then actually have that 3 be narrowed down to 1? And so, yeah, so that kind of mind boggled us, but we were so used to being mind boggled at that time that I don't think this particular twist stood out among some of the other ones. So, yeah, but it definitely didn't feel like a good one. It definitely didn't feel like a good one. And I have to say, poor Baden. I think that poor Baden had just a run of bad luck in so many ways. He had that egg on that, stand-in auction, and I think he just had a run of bad luck for him, because I think if both Emmett and Danny had voted together, they would have voted for Hayley. I think I thought that they would have voted for Hayley. I thought the decision to vote for Baden was more Danny's decision, but now having watched it back, I was like, oh, maybe that is actually what they had agreed on initially. So that particular piece of information was new to me in that way, about how I'm not sure if it's the edit either. I haven't actually confirmed nor denied that on their end, but it was an interesting piece of information for me.
So on the sort of the subject of some of the more controversial things within the season, which for us as fans, I think some of the twists, Riley was a little bit more okay with some of them than me. I didn't like the amount of twists that were happening, but I'm a salty old school Survivor fan, and that's why. And, you know, another thing for me that sort of stood out this season was that the challenges seemed to be extremely lopsided, where you had a season of Brains versus Brawns. One half of the season is Brains, the other side is Brawns, but it seemed that 80 to 90% of the challenges was Brawn heavy. Did you come into this season sort of expecting it to be a little bit more balanced? Were you shocked by the amount of sort of Brawn heavy challenges in the season that had both Brains and Brawns? Because obviously the one challenge you ultimately ended up winning was one where you required Brains to win it, which it showed that you could actually do that pretty successfully and win some immunities. Did you feel like, did you expect, I guess it's expect the unexpected, but what was your expectations in regards to the challenges coming into the season?
Definitely, I think with the challenges, I had expected a little bit more Brain going into the challenge. I was like, well, it's a season of Brains versus Brawn, and also knowing that, you know, I was a gap filler and that I fulfilled a certain criteria, you know, in applying. I think, yeah, I did expect that there would be more puzzles. It was one thing that I did practice because of time and everything. You practice your strengths. You know, I'm not going to suddenly be able to lift 100 kilos. That I can't do that in a short amount of time. But something you're good at, you can hone. So I did practice my puzzles as much as possible before coming in, because I knew that was something that I could accelerate and be much better at with an edge. So yeah, unfortunately, that didn't pan out so well for me through most of the challenges. Yeah, I do feel like the challenges felt quite Brawn centric. So there was a lot of agility and balance and stuff like that, which I think could help, like, you know, someone like Hayley, who's obviously quite, you know, has that body type and her history in dance and everything. And I think, but a lot of that did feel like it was still very physical for people like me and George, who do kind of make up that more brain components. We both found the challenges quite physically challenging in many ways. But yeah, George is a stronger person than me and everything. He has more upper body strength. He trained a lot more. But yeah, it did feel a bit lopsided. But in the moment, I think I just was accepting of this is just how it's going to be. Things I cannot control. Stockholm syndrome, it feels like, in so many ways. Yeah, what a season. What a bunch of challenges. Oh, what were they thinking?
Obviously, George and Kara came back onto your side, and they helped you to eliminate a string of competitors in Gerald, Emmett, and then eventually Andrew, who started to go against Hayley and George a little bit there. And you were left at this final 6 scenario, obviously, with Danny and Flick on the Brawn tribe, Kara and George, who have been close since day one, and then you and Hayley, with the urn twist in play as well. So there was that little bit to wrestle with there. Obviously, you and Hayley in particular were, at least from what we saw on the edit, very tight, and the swing vote on most of those votes there. how much did you sort of think about going against George, especially with that urn twist in play, or potentially having that backfire on you? And was this sort of the point where you started to think about the end game and how you got to the final tribal council?
Yeah, so the final six is interesting. The urns are interesting, and a bunch of things are happening quite a bit at this stage. Yes, Haley and I have been working together pretty much since early day on, and I think they showed it more, and it didn't become more apparent until later on, which again is just storytelling and just too many things to show at that time. So yeah, I think in that final six, you flirt with every single possibility. You cannot, certainly for players like myself and Haley, who are just basically like trying to think strategically, and you flirt with every single idea. And you also let your emotions go into that a little bit. Like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we just, because there was, as much as there's strategy and stuff involved, you do kind of go, wouldn't it just be great if we just, and I think they played out some of those dialogues quite a bit where we do kind of joke, let's just vote out George, and everyone does say that often. And it is a default scenario that we all discuss for various reasons. Like I said, I love George as a human. We're very good friends now, but there are instances because he is such a bombastic player that you kind of go, it wouldn't be controlled chaos or less chaos isn't necessarily a bad thing, but strategically, and it always comes down, especially for players like me and Haley, where you just look at how it plays out, and it just never felt like strategically the correct move. You always say it. Well, we always said it because and then they edit it and go, look, they keep considering voting for them, because you consider all options, especially in that situation. But yes, I think it was about strength and where we felt, I think, I guess the final two, so I think that as you get to that point, you do start to think about final two. I think I probably only started thinking about what the combinations of final two looked like at final five. I think at final six, we were still looking at our pairs and locking our pairs in as strong as possible, because those pairs were, there's a lot of power in pairs, because if you have a strong pair, you know that you can move as a block, and especially in those number situations, it's tricky. It is when you get to five when you realize now there are no more pairs. There's only two pairs and an outsider, and then that person becomes that extra component. So yeah, so I think outside of knowing that George and Kara especially were such an unbreakable pair, and we knew that they would be unbreakable for a while, you kind of just have to keep forming those blocks against each other while working with them. And we were just able to work with them and continue those blocks. So it was a tough discussion. And I think that's the thing, is that because we had those solid pairs, those conversations were harder. And when we got to Flick, it was a bit like, well, what do we do now? And that kind of last vote right before I got, idled out, was that we could try and break someone up, but do we really think Kara and George are breakable? And I'm sure there were discussions, and there absolutely were discussions of breaking up me and Haley at that point. And though that was probably a better one to try and navigate, because as we think about those, what does that dynamic look like, and how that eventually panned out. So I'm not surprised that I ended up where I ended up. I'm actually very grateful, and I think that's an X for me. While it would have been amazing to get to final three and final two, I also I personally didn't have a very clear path to it, because I was aware of these pair dynamics and how we're going to break them up, and who's actually the weaker pair, and where can you find those cracks, and you recognize those and kind of have to play with them, because no one's going to suddenly have a brain lobotomy and change who they are. So you kind of just have to work with that as best you can.
I do want to backtrack just a little bit before I go back, because I'm hearing you on the pairs, and I'm assuming that your end game was going to be going with Hayley to the end, and I do have a question around that for you. But before that, you had someone else in the game that sounded like they may have been a bit of a pair for you, or an option to be a pair for you as well, that you ended up taking out, which was Andrew. Do you feel like taking Andrew out at the spot that you did potentially made your road to the end harder, because you didn't have that extra person there that could win challenges and potentially help you get to the end and take you with them? What was that relationship like? Because it did look like you guys were pretty tight as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. So yes, Andrew is a funny one, because my road with Andrew, and my journey with Andrew began in the dune buggy, because Andrew was my driver when we all arrive. Right. And you see that bad backstage. So we never really could talk at that stage. But it's funny, because we have this, I'm a big, sap basically, and have these emotional moments that you guys have all been privy to. And I think I did have a conversation of our journey starts in the dune buggy, which is why I'm saying it now. So yeah, we spent the most time together. Again, it's interesting because for me, the Andrew vote was pretty straightforward. I do know that the edit made it seem like I would work with him more. And there was, of course, options and thoughts that I had in my brain. And specifically with George saying that, oh, Andrew, put your name up, etc., and all of that stuff. For me, and I knew I was in the swing vote position and that I was the one being courted to go into to try and vote the other way. And I considered it, but it was relatively a straightforward vote for me because I knew that for me, it felt, I was very conscious of working with Hayley as long as I physically could, because I really enjoyed working with her and felt that we had a very strong, similar ways of thinking. We joked a lot throughout the game that we kind of shared the same brain. There were like things that were boring, but we play word association games with the tribe, stuff you never see on TV. But in those types of games where we're doing stuff like that, we always made similar guesses and we always like kind of thought in similar patterns. So we recognized that we actually thought very similarly, which made working together very easy, because there were many times where I didn't have to justify my position or try and explain something, and vice versa. We just kind of got it. So that made it a lot easier for me to want to work with her. So in knowing that I wanted to work with Hayley and knowing that we were working with George and Kara, I just didn't see any room for Andrew in the alliance. We had the strong 4. There wasn't any point in bringing a 5. We already had that majority. We weren't gonna, as much as it hurt me emotionally, strategically, I was never really going. It was not one of the more difficult votes for me to make, even though I knew I was the swing vote there. But for TV purposes, I think that got played up a lot more, or something of that nature. So yeah, I never considered what that would have looked like if I worked with Andrew, but I don't think that I would have stayed. I didn't have strong enough connections, even with Andrew, compared to my connection with Hayley, that we could have worked together for me to get much further than how I ended up by working with Hayley. I felt that it brought me further down the track where I could actually see maybe there'd be a final 2, but you are going to ask me that question now.
Yeah, so sort of leading into that, so going to the end potentially with Hayley, if that was your plan to go to the end with Hayley, or if you landed in the final with Hayley, what would have been your case to the jury to win the title of sole survivor above Hayley, who had a pretty impressive resume up until this point? And were you aware of how big of a threat she would be going into that final tribal council?
1,000%. And yes, I think Hayley and I had always discussed kind of what a final 3 could look like, knowing that immunity challenge, always endurance, what that would look like. And we were kind of discussing some different permutations on that. I had slightly different thoughts about it, and that is because of the type of game, what I thought I would bring to the jury if I got into a final tribal was, of course, my underdog story. And I think that was specifically what I was leaning on in any kind of final tribal pitch. Was I did have a lot of friends on the jury, not in the same way that Flick did, where, she was Braun and there were quite a number of Braun members. So there were technically more brain members in there in the end, once you bring everyone out of the final 4 where we had so many brains and everyone else goes back in the jury. But I think ultimately I did feel like I could rely on sort of that underdog story of, personal growth and accomplishment. And it's a very different thing because I also recognize that this particular jury wasn't really a jury of super fans like you guys. I think the type of game that Hayley played was absolutely amazing. I was immensely impressed. And I don't think I would have stood a chance against someone like Hayley, but I was going to definitely try with emotional pleas of personal growth. And also that ultimately, while Hayley made a lot of the more verbal moves of, she's more extroverted than me. She's a lot more, I'm a quieter thinker and kind of introspective. She went out there and built a lot of those relationships, which is amazing and, fantastic. And, she deserves it just because she did so much of that legwork. But we did move in step a lot with our strategic making. And of course, I didn't get voted out. She did, but that's fine. So I think things like that were probably what was playing along my brain, because we did actually make a lot of the same moves. And there were things that, I think working together, Hayley and I were recognizing that we were often in the majority, pretty much voting in the majority for most of the votes. I think, recognizing that we always had the numbers and we always knew what those, so kind of those types of things were what we were thinking through. And also, while you're thinking about that, you're not fully forming the entire story until you basically know you're there, because anything can change. If someone else wins immunity, that story changes. So I think, yeah, my story was unique. I think, and that was probably the only story I had, was essentially, you know, what I had personally gone through to be able to do that, and hope that maybe that would sway enough of a jury. Would it have worked? I don't know. I don't think so. I think Hayley's a very, very deserving winner. And if she, again, if I was standing next to her and she won, there would be no part of me that would have been like, darn, that should have been me. I think that she's an exceptionally deserving winner, as is George. I think ultimately we got the final two that, you know, of the two best players, even though it's amazing that that happens, because you think that they would be threats against each other. But it makes us, you know, as fans and watchers, just really appreciative of how that unfolded.
What did you think of George and Hayley's pictures at the final tribal council? And did you sort of wrestle with voting for George at a point, or were you really set on voting for Hayley, given the game she played throughout? And obviously, you guys working so closely throughout the game.
Look, you do go into the final tribal. I think you go into the final tribal, you've played the game for so long and you have deep respect for the game. So as much as, like, I think there's no way that you're going to go in there and not pay the respect the tribal is pay the respect that the tribal is due because of the game. I think, at least I wouldn't. I definitely went into tribal. Yes, I knew I had a very strong alliance with Hayley. It wasn't so much the alliance, but I guess the type of game she played was very similar to mine strategically, in the way we evaluated moves and stuff like that. So that definitely had her higher up in the who would I potentially vote for. But I had too much respect for the jury and for the jury process to kind of go, no, I'm going to dismiss anything that happens in final tribal. I think that would be terrible. And, you know, kind of what is the point? And we've been through this much already, Stockholm Syndrome, but we've been through so much that we have to pay it its due respect. So definitely I would have weighed up the point of to vote George. I personally don't think George did a great job in that final tribal. I think he had such an amazing game. I think he presented that well, but I think Hayley's lines were clearer. Hayley owned everything, including how she ended up on Redemption Rock, which I personally was very impressed by. And I felt that that's amazing. She's owning it. She's owning it as a strategic move. Yes, it got her voted off, but she's owning it as a move, which is, you know, I have deep respect for that. And I felt that George's final tribal wasn't as strong in that way. I think George missed the mark in many of the questions, and you didn't see my final question, but my final question to George specifically was about his allies and his choice of allies. And he picked such amazing allies, especially in Kara. And what did he learn from them? And I think it was a way for him to kind of demonstrate some humility in his game, which you don't see a lot of. And I think a lot of us were asking those types of questions, like Gerald's question, like, you know, who would you work with, etc. And I think he just missed that mark. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that what he says is valid, but it wasn't what the jury was looking for. So I think by missing that mark, it kind of meant that it was harder to kind of, even if strategically you're strong, ultimately the jury makes the decision based on who they think should win the game. It's not who do you think played the strategically most optimal game. It is who are you voting for? That's the only criteria, essentially, given the game. And so I think that, yeah, I think tribal could have swayed me more, but it didn't, is ultimately my decision on that. And I think George played an amazing game, and in many situations that he definitely would have been my pick. Just against Hayley in that tribal, that didn't pan out.
All right, so two last questions here from us before we know we kept you around for a little bit longer than what we said we would, and we really appreciate your time.
Chatty, it seems.
I really appreciate your time for this. So one of the questions that I asked you in the beginning was who played the best game and who were you happy to take out before the merge? If you could only choose one player to go back and play the game again after the merge that didn't make it to the final two, let's make it final three, because I feel like Flick would get a lot of love. So if you could choose someone outside of the final three, and it can't be yourself, who do you think played the best game after the merge that potentially got clipped a bit early and that you think should get another shot at playing the game?
Oh,
Justice for
think,
Biden?
yeah.
No, I don't want to. I don't want to influence your decision.
I
don't wanna
know, I
influence
know.
it.
Look, justice for Biden, but I actually would have been very curious how Emmett would have gone further. I'm very curious, and only because I do feel very responsible in a good way. But taking myself out of this equation specifically as to post-merge, just that control of power, and if it were, because I was most surprised because he was controlling his threat level quite consistently in that he was such a big threat. And then once he fell into the minority, he was just agreeing with anyone to try and kind of manage that, which is where he spearheaded the let's vote for George piece before Haley and I switched our votes. I'm just very curious how he was playing a fairly good strategic game in that way. And obviously physically he was quite a challenge. So I'd be very curious what the rest of his game would have looked like if it weren't for, my particular position in that, to switch my vote and vote out Emmett there, how much further he could have gotten, because I think he was playing an exceptional game there on many fronts. And I think it is that kind of all three elements of social, physical, and strategic. So I'm just very curious. Yeah, I'm such a curious person, and that's probably going to be my detriment because I'll end up burning myself because I probably would have been next. But my vote is that my curiosity leads me to say Emmett.
Obviously, being a children's book author, I do want to give you a little bit of a lighter question. Haley and George, obviously, we know that you resonate a lot with the animal, the quokka, obviously being a very smiley animal. If you were to put Haley and George into a picture book as animals, what animals would you characterize them as?
Oh, wow. Okay. Ooh. Okay, I have to think about this one. Wow. I'm being put on the spot. Okay, Haley, I think. Or is George going to be easier? Hang on, I need a thought on this.
I don't know why for me, but I feel like and I don't. You go with whatever you were going to say. I feel like George is a meerkat. I really feel like he's a meerkat. I get the Lion King meerkat, especially with those dance moves that he did out on the island as well. Like I see it.
Oh my
But I don't want to
God,
influence your thinking.
And I that was one of the first things I thought of, but I felt like meerkats travel in packs and George is more of a lone wolf. Like there's such a big thing when it comes to meerkats. They have this whole family, but I like my I'm weirdly gonna say I think George is a bit of a salamander. I don't know why that's the new one. And I think it is just he's a very he's kind of that amphibious nature. I think salamanders are amphibious. I hope I'm getting this right. But just kind of he kind of can blend in a certain way, but he's also quite his own unique character. He's such a character. So he's not like camouflaged in any way. So I'm not saying he's a chameleon, but just something about him is this really, and salamanders are super friendly creatures as well, and they're very quite adorable and everything like that. But then also being very unique and different and kind of not something you would have previously expected and stuff like that. I think George is a salamander in many ways. And then and just having but I like meerkat. I think meerkat's a good one as well. And
For me, I think it's
Haley,
just he just reminded me in the way that he sort of did that dance and the uprightness and how he moved. It was more like the physical thing. I was like, that reminded me of the Lion King with the meerkat standing up. Yeah.
Yeah, when they do the little hula dancing and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Yeah. All good. Now Haley's got a bit of an interesting. Who would you peg Haley for now? Now I'm curious about how you're.
Funny enough for me, well, if I'm going to keep it Lion King strong, I'd probably put her as a hyena, and more in the sense that she goes with a pack, and hyenas is ferociously dangerous, and also the female hyena is the leader of the pack, so I feel like, not physically, she looks anything but a hyena. She's gorgeous, but just due to the hierarchy and the queen and the hyena being the main sort of dominant, sort of leader within that pack, it's probably where I would put her personally. But I don't know. I don't want to steal your question. You definitely have a think about it and potentially nominate one there as well. I'm just thinking, Riley's made me think of, he sort of sprung it on both of us, this question. I didn't know he was going to ask it. So now I'm going to have Lion King in my head when I go to bed.
Oh, good, which is fantastic. Hey, there could be so many worse things in that like that. Yeah, and now I've got Lion King in my brain, so I'm thinking of that as well. Look, I think Haley, I do kind of see like being the queen and kind of and sort of I do kind of see a lioness in her as well, where
Yeah, that's
her
what I was thinking.
nobility
Yeah.
and stuff like that, but also the way I think she just does work really well with people and stuff like that, and with the rest of I guess what are they called, pride? Yeah, the rest of the pride and stuff like that, but working really well. And she is also just, physically quite a beast in that challenge beast sort of way. So, the Whaley in me kind of has to keep her in sort of that kind of well elevated status. So I'm going to go with the lioness for Hayley, just to round off your Lion Kings.
Yeah, it makes 100% sense. Now, final question: if you were asked to come back and play the game of Survivor again, would you put yourself through it again?
I'll have to think long and hard for that. I don't solve problems I don't have. That's going to be my first thing. Look, I have to think. I went into the game wanting, to challenge myself. That was definitively what I wanted to do. I was like, this is something that's going to be so extraordinary, and I would regret it so much if I said no, because I was slightly worried about what am I going to do with water. All those things. I was like, look, logistically, they're not going to let me die. I want to give it a go and see how far I get. I have to see, if I were to go back, what else I would gain from it. And I'm not at this stage, especially so fresh off, I'm not entirely sure. But then again, stranger things have happened. I mean, I went on in the first place, so we'll have to see.
No, it's fair enough, and I do appreciate it's obviously very in short succession of actually playing the game that I'm asking this question. It'd be very difficult to know. But really, we appreciate your time, Wai, to come on the show here today with us, talk a little bit about your game. And, I think for myself and Riley, it's given us a lot more insights, especially in those specific stages in the game where we didn't get to see your thinking and how you're sort of was strategizing there out in the game. Do you have any last minute advice, I guess, for anybody that is going to play the game in the future? I know there is a Blood vs. Water season that's already, I believe they've already started filming, so you probably can't give advice to them. But for anybody else in the future that wants to go and play the game, is there any advice you can give for someone that is going to go out there and play the game, and specifically someone that potentially fits in your archetype as well if they go out there and play the game? Because I think it'll be pretty relevant for them, and if they were out there and they played with some pretty dominant, I guess, physical beasts on Australian Survivor, what advice would you give them, and what can they do to better prepare themselves if they were to get the call?
Yeah, definitely. I think I was just absolutely stoked and grateful, I think, through every single part of it, even in the parts that were really tough. And I think keeping that gratitude in mind is kind of going to be what I think carried me far. It helped definitely with my relationships. I think the main thing is not to be worried about it and not to think too much about it. There were just so many things that I was so unsure of, but I was like, it'll be fine. And I think going for it is the way to do it. And I'm personally really proud of myself of how far I went. The fact that I lasted the 44 days is phenomenal, and I never thought that was possible. And I think just have no fear, put the fear aside. I mean, I was still fearful of water, but putting that aside and giving it a go. And I think being true to that and as authentic and grateful for that is what I think can carry you far. So best of luck, and I believe in you.
Well, Wai, we want to thank you, and hopefully in the future, we can have you when we do another season, and if we do recaps on Brawns vs. Brawns. We had 2 survivors on our recaps this season, in Baden Gilbert and Andy Meldrum, who we really enjoyed having on the show, and we'd love to have you on as a guest in the future as well. If you have time at that time, we'll reach out. Obviously, we won't book you in before February because we don't know what you'll be doing then, but 100% would love to have you back on the show.
I would absolutely love it. And I know I'll be watching Survivor. So, we'll all be doing that. So I would absolutely love it. And thank you both so much. Again, it's been so great. And it was throughout that time, connecting with super fans like yourselves and your viewers and stuff like that, that really kind of brought the game to life. And we're just great. We're, without you guys, there would be no show and no game. So great, really grateful for that. I appreciate it. So hope to be back.